Hello, my name is Marija and this is an Oxford University Press video on the new theory of knowledge specification, going into first teaching in 2020 and first assessment in 2022. In this video, we'll do a quick overview of the assessment model of TOK and discuss the key changes to assessment in the new spec. But mostly, we will focus on the wholly new internal assessment task. Many DP educators appreciate that TOK has value beyond its share of the 3 bonus points in the diploma program. It's important to consider the extent to which assessment drives learning in TOK and the extent to which it should. The IB strikes this balance in a particular way with the amount of teaching time and the number of points it ascribes to TOK assessment. But in your classroom, you get to set the tone for the role that assessment will play for your students. Whether you're preparing for teaching the new spec in a couple of months or you are a new teacher coming to TOK after 2020, this video is for you. So let's jump right in. The course continues to be assessed through 2 tasks, an externally assessed essay on a prescribed title and an internally assessed exhibition, which continue to be weighted at 65% and 35% respectively. The essay is now specifically focused on the areas of knowledge. The IB has made this very clear, but I'm flagging it because there has been some confusion in informal discussion groups online. The exhibition replaces the TOK presentation as the internally assessed task. It is geared towards assessing the core theme and the optional themes, which are also new elements of the course. Later in this video, I will be laying out supports for first teaching and clarifying how all of these new elements come together in the IA. The guide recommends 18 teaching hours dedicated to assessment across both tasks, and this is intended to set expectations about how much contact time we ought to spend on assessment in the classroom. The guide also recommends that the exhibition take place in the first year of the program. There are very good reasons for this recommendation, but it is worth mentioning that if you choose to follow it, the implication for how you organize the course is that you will likely lead with teaching the 2 optional themes, rather than starting with something that you are perhaps a little bit more familiar with, such as one of the AOKs. Just something to keep in mind. Next, we are going to look at some of the key changes to assessment in 2020. Let's start with the essay here. The TOK essay, the externally assessed task, has remained largely unchanged in this specification. It is still an extended written response on a choice of 6 prescribed titles set by the IB each examination session. There are 3 things to highlight in relation to the essay. 1. The fact that there is no optionality in the course with respect to the AOKs, all 5 are now required to be taught, means that the prescribed titles can now ask students to draw on specific AOKs. What this means for teaching is that there's no hiding from mathematics or the arts or whatever other AOK we were least confident about tackling with our students. Recognizing this, the AOK chapters in our book are written to provide both content and structure so that any teacher, regardless of their domain expertise, can teach any of the AOKs to a standard where they can be confident that they are preparing their students well for assessment. And though this remains to be seen, I expect that this shift will also make prescribed titles more accessible, lowering the level of abstraction. Where before the prescribed title needed to be possible to address through any and all of the 8 different areas of knowledge, now we might see a narrower initial gap between the really quite conceptual language of the prescribed title and the real-world examples from specific AOKs. The 2020 specification also finally clarifies the role of knowledge questions in the essay, which has been the source of quite a bit of confusion for teachers and students alike. In fact, in the whole course, the focus is shifting away from teaching students how to formulate their knowledge questions to teaching them how to explore and respond to them. The IB now provides the knowledge questions. The prescribed titles will themselves be phrased as knowledge questions, and so long as students focus their effort on responding to the prescribed title fully and directly, this actually sets them up for success by already focusing the discussion on knowledge. What they are being assessed on now is the quality of their discussion, which brings us to the assessment instrument. What makes for a good discussion in a successful TOK essay? Well, the instrument calls for a clear, coherent, and critical exploration of the essay title. The descriptors have been updated to clarify what the examiners will be looking for. Essentially, success in the essay is staked on the student's ability to understand and fully respond to the title by clearly articulating their arguments, effectively supporting them by offering specific examples, showing awareness and at the higher levels of achievement evaluation of different points of view, and finally, drawing the implications of arguments into a convincing conclusion. Our assessment chapter goes into much more detail about best practices at each of these steps of the writing process, as well as common pitfalls and how to avoid them. But we also recognize that this is much of what teachers are already doing to prepare students for the essay. With quite a few other things changing and shifting in the course, we can lean on the familiarity, by and large, of the TOK essay. Now, in terms of the TOK exhibition, on the other hand, we have a completely new internal assessment task. So we will go into quite a bit of detail here, specifically about how to support students at every step of coming up with their TOK exhibition, and how to teach with the exhibition in mind, building and practicing the exhibition skills along the way. But first, in terms of the nature of the task, what it preserves from the TOK presentation is that it continues to explore the relationship between the real world and knowledge, grounding the TOK course in a concrete sense of relevance to the wider world. At the same time, the exhibition is designed quite cleverly, in fact, to address some of the known challenges with the previous IA. For example, the exhibition closes the gap between what the teacher sees and what the moderator sees, and is also significantly less time-consuming as compared to the presentation. Next, I'd like to offer some insights and guidance gleaned from designing the task with the curriculum review team and trialing it with our own students. As teachers, we will need to support students with choosing a prompt, selecting their objects, describing the objects well, and being able to articulate the interconnections and relationships among the different elements of the exhibition. To take it from the top, the first thing that students will do is choose one of the 35 IA prompts, phrased as knowledge questions and provided by the IB, to become the basis of their exhibition. These are generally pretty high-level prompts. They include questions like, why do we seek knowledge? Or, are some things unknowable? I think it's also fair to say that some prompts, at least initially, appear more accessible than others. Like, for example, how important are material tools in the production of knowledge might readily call to mind laboratory equipment or scientific instruments. The idea here is not to move our students towards one or another type of prompt, but to appreciate that there is a range of options. One tip to offer to students who are still struggling to make the jump from the prompt to objects is to read the list of prompts through the lens of the different themes. So a prompt like, does some knowledge belong only to particular communities of knowers, might sound really abstract at first until we see it through the lens of, let's say, indigenous societies or religion. In general, the process of selecting an IA prompt is really quite similar to selecting a prescribed title, except there are 35 to choose from and not 6, and we know that even with 6 it can really become an active form of procrastination when students keep changing their minds. So encourage students to choose well, but also encourage them to choose sooner rather than later so that they can get on with actually curating the exhibition. A question that comes up is whether it's okay if students choose a prompt based on an object that they already know that they'll want to include, or if they have to start with the prompt. The IB thankfully leaves this open. In any case, there is no way to control this part of the creative process. Our minds work in different ways and fire in different directions. This is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, and ultimately how the exhibition started matters less than how it all comes together in the end. Okay, so this far, this should be the easy part. But before we get into objects and descriptions, a word again about the nature of the task. In general, the exhibition seems to be well received by teachers. But one question that comes up repeatedly is what skills are actually being assessed here? Along with a bit of a worry about the rigor of a task that appears more descriptive than analytical. It will be important to make sure that students don't misunderstand this task for choose and describe 3 objects that are important or interesting to you about knowledge. That's not what it is. In the IA assessment instrument, descriptive is in fact a characteristic of an exhibition at the lowest level of achievement. So there is no ambiguity from the IB side about what kind of task this is. The task doesn't call for descriptions of the objects, but for a commentary, identifying the objects in context, justifying their inclusion into the exhibition, articulating their relationship to the prompt. The commentary requires a critical approach to selection, representation, and explanation, and it is with this understanding that students should go into selecting their objects for their exhibition, which is what they will do at step 2. They will select 3 objects in relation to their chosen prompt. And it's great how much latitude the IB gives here with respect to what is an appropriate object for the exhibition. The shorter list by far is the one of ineligible or poor choices of objects for the exhibition, so let's go over that one instead. An object cannot be created for the purpose of the exhibition. It has to be a pre-existing object, and then it is okay if it's an object that was made by the student. Also, an object should not be generic, standing in for a whole category of objects. For instance, a stock image of an old radio to talk about technology and the dissemination of knowledge. Finally, an object should not be symbolic, representing an idea in relation to the prompt but having no material connection to it. For instance, a broken mirror to symbolize the fragmentation of knowledge systems. Beyond this, a great range of objects are appropriate, from digital objects such as memes, to the front page of newspapers, to buildings, and so on. What helped my students was to check that the object was at some point involved in some way in the processes of knowledge, the production, acquisition, dissemination, or application of knowledge. Sometimes students will want to include in their exhibition objects that are not available to them, like a famous painting, a rare book, the Hubble Space Telescope. In this case, it's acceptable to exhibit an image of the object in place of that object. But images can also be objects in their own right. If the image is, let's say, of a rocket launch, the student should make clear whether the object exhibited is the rocket, the image of the event, or that particular photograph of that particular event. Where it gets a little bit tricky is with photographs of people, such as the portrait of Sharbat Gula, also known as Afghan Girl from the cover of National Geographic. In situations like this, the students should make clear that the object being exhibited here is the photograph and not the person in the photograph. It's likely that students will brainstorm a number of objects before selecting their final 3. This is an opportunity for them to reflect on how they're making this decision and what their selection means. Pausing for this kind of reflection here can help students clarify their reasons for including their objects. And this clarity is rewarded because the task requires them to justify the contribution of each object to the exhibition. Just like every map is necessarily simplification from a particular point of view, so too the exhibition is necessarily a unique but limited selection. More importantly is the student selection. They are responsible for it. What are they choosing to include, and what are they choosing to exclude or ignore, and why? This is what makes selection a critical process and a political process of what is worth representing and how it is being represented. Which brings us to the next step. At step 3, students will need to provide a commentary of each object, identifying it in its context. There are all sorts of rich issues of representation here. Objects, specifically when we look at them in context, have complex and multidimensional histories, well beyond what can be captured with 300 words, which is approximately what our students will have for each object. They will need to make decisions about what to emphasize about the object and its context. Which part of the descriptions matter and are relevant? Perhaps it matters exactly what the object is made of, or perhaps it's not relevant at all. The more students know about the object, the more they will have to draw on to come up with a commentary that has depth and nuance. There is a certain intimacy that is being rewarded by this, which I think is the right thing to reward, a curiosity about the familiar objects in our lives and our surroundings, whose stories we know and understand, and from which we can extract meaning. With the potential for misrepresentation here, there's a real incentive to encourage students to work with objects they are familiar with, or at least committed to finding out more about. Remind them that they are accountable for how they represent these objects. Especially when referring to objects coming from material cultures that students are unfamiliar with, they should be respectful of the knowledge traditions that these objects are embedded in, and aware of the limitations of their own understanding. One of the prompts, in fact, even asks, does some knowledge belong only to particular communities of knowers? There is a risk with some combinations of themes and prompts in particular that the exhibition turns into a kind of present-day cabinet of curiosities with delightful wonder, yes, but also with all the problematic politics of exoticizing, trivializing, and otherwise distorting objects that students know little about. Let me give you an example that can also serve as a lesson. The Matatua Warenui, a carved Maori meeting house. In the 1870s, it was disassembled and packed onto a steamship, traveling from what is now known as New Zealand to the British Empire Exhibition in Sydney. So began the Matatua's 100-year-long tour of the empire. The Matatua was hauled on ships and trains across multiple destinations and was at some point even trimmed to fit inside museum buildings. On its first stop in Sydney, where this photo was taken, the Matatua was reassembled with the intricate carvings of its inside walls now facing the outside, in full view of the visitors, but also in full disregard of Maori protocol, as if plucking it out of the ground for show was not bad enough already. By way of this transformation, the Matatua went from being a culturally significant gathering site to being ethnological curiosity, strangely seen by strange people in strange places. But no more. It would take a century, but the Matatua ultimately returned home. Its lesson for us in TOK? Don't steal. Its other lesson, that in the exhibition, the opportunity to represent objects is inseparable from the responsibility to do it well and accurately. The commentary serves as the evidence for the relationship between the object and the prompt, and so the appropriateness of this evidence is one aspect that is being assessed. So let us look at supporting students with making connections visible and articulating them in their commentary. This is the last step. Students will have 950 words for their commentary in which they need to contextualize each of the objects and explain their relationship to the prompt. Where the commentary comes in is in recognizing that objects, no matter how well selected, don't speak for themselves. The purpose of the commentary is for students to make their thinking visible to anyone viewing their exhibition who may or may not know them and their motivations. This includes the IB moderator, but we should encourage students to do this not out of compliance, but because it is good practice. In one sentence, the way that I would describe the role of the commentary to my students is these 950 words should convince me that they have not stumbled on these objects by chance, that they have thought about and they can articulate the reasons for including these objects in their exhibition and not others. In doing this, they are demonstrating that they understand how TOK manifests in the world, which is the single driving question of the TOK exhibition task. Some questions that have helped my students more clearly understand and articulate this that you can also offer to your students are: how does each object enrich or advance our understanding of the TOK concept or concepts in the prompt? You will remember that all prompts are knowledge questions, and so they all draw on TOK concepts. Another question is, have you managed to both ground the object in its real-world context and link them effectively to the prompt? Each object should simultaneously be able to perform both of these functions. Another one is, are you able to articulate each object's unique relationship to the prompt? It's unlikely that objects will relate to the prompt in exactly the same way, so repetition in the justification for including them is often a sign of generalization or oversimplification. Finally, what do your chosen objects seen together allow you to say about the prompt? There may be tensions or contradictions between the objects, and this is not something that the student needs to hide or necessarily aim to resolve. Indeed, the student may have intentionally selected the objects to create these tensions. Highlighting them in relation to the prompt demonstrates that they have an understanding that knowledge can manifest in the world in complex and messy ways. If done well, this can add depth and nuance to their exhibition. And that is the last step. At this point, your students are ready to showcase their work. The IB requires that students have the opportunity to share their completed exhibitions with an audience, but teachers have a lot of flexibility as to what this looks like. These interactions are not formally assessed, but it can be very rewarding for students to engage with their audience's perspectives in this way, a skill that will actually serve them well for the rest of the course. Having made it this far in the video, you may be wondering or recognizing that little of what we are used to doing in TOK specifically prepares our students for a task like this. So let us turn briefly to how you can prepare for teaching of the new spec with the exhibition in mind. Before we ask our students to make connections between TOK concepts and objects in the world, we should consider ways to role model this kind of material engagement with knowledge in our teaching. In a previous video, I discussed why it is a good idea moving forward to teach knowledge as a practice and as a material practice. You can listen to that part of the video by following the link. A practical suggestion is to use objects as stimulus material, especially in your teaching of the core and the optional themes. In some ways, the natural and accessible place to do this is in the context of methods and tools, one of the headings that are required in each theme and AOK. This is a good start, but you can go beyond objects as tools in the production of knowledge and consider how they play a variety of roles in the different processes of knowledge. For example, the golden record that was attached to each of the Voyager spacecraft can be an amazing stimulus material with links to language and technology, but also to the arts and the human sciences and mathematics. Get students to identify connections between the stimulus and the IA prompts and get them to explain the relationship to the rest of the class. In the case of the golden record, for example, they might identify links to prompts such as in what ways do values affect the production of knowledge, or are some types of knowledge less open to interpretation than others? And then collectively they can practice articulating what the relationship is here. For some students, going from object to prompt might be easier than the other way around. So getting them to practice this in advance of the exhibition can help them with being able to make this connection both ways later. It is possible that it can feel as if, as a teacher, you're being asked to do a challenging new thing in a challenging new part of the syllabus. But with the centering of objects in the IA, we are being nudged in the direction of considering more diverse forms and practices of knowledge, including know-how and knowledge which may be difficult or impossible to articulate in words. With that, we are inviting more diverse knowers and knowledge systems into the course, deepening and enriching the engagement with knowledge for our students. This brings us to the end of this video. I hope that this overview of the TOK assessment model and the deep dive into the IA task has been useful for you, and that you are feeling more confident and excited about supporting your TOK students through the assessment. Thank you for watching and for sharing your time with me, and all the best on your TOK teaching adventure.